Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Demand Management, a cost-effective emissions-free alternative to New York City's aging peaker power plants. We have an excellent panel of guest speakers with us today, but before we pass it over to them, I'd like to go over some webinar logistics. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled. You can submit questions and comments via the questions panel. Please submit your questions as the webinar is going on. You don't have to wait till the end. We like to save 15 minutes at the end for speakers to answer attendee questions. Speaker bios are available in the materials section. Automated captions are available. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a recording within 48 hours, and you can also find it on the Clean Energy Group website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, my colleague Seth Mullendore.
Thanks to everybody who's joining us today. It's going to be an exciting webinar. A new report that was recently released from the Peak Coalition. As we get into it today, I'm just going to do a little bit of an intro for those of you not familiar with Clean Energy Group. We are a national nonprofit working towards the goal of affordable, reliable, clean energy for all. Our work spans a number of different areas with a focus on climate resilience and community health, distributed energy access and equity, energy storage and flexible demand, and fossil fuel replacement, which is the focus of today's webinar, as well as flexible demand. So this webinar is in our work to replace peaker plants. Next slide, please. Clean Energy Group for the past several years has been running an initiative called the Phase Out Peakers Work, where we work across the country, mostly in partnership and in collaboration with community-based organizations that have peaker power plants in their communities and negatively impacting the health of their neighbors. We usually provide the technical support on campaigns to work towards accelerating the retirement of peaker power plants and the build out of clean alternatives, which can span a number of different technologies and solutions. We also work a lot on the policy side as well. So if we go to the next slide, today's webinar, I'm really excited about this new report, Demanding a Better Grid. We'll get into that a little bit more later. This is a Peak Coalition report, and I'll introduce you to folks at the Peak Coalition. If you would like to check out the report, you can go to that web address below. It's in the publications on Clean Energy Group's website, as well as the Peak Coalition website. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. So we're going to be kind of trading off back and forth who is presenting from Peak Coalition. We have Sebastian Valles, who is the Just Transition Coordinator for UPROSE. Megan Carr, who is an Environmental Justice Fellow with the New York Lawyers for Public Interest. Daniel Chu, who is Senior Energy Planner for the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. And Dariela Rodriguez, who is the Director of Community Development for the Point CDC. Great. All right. With that, if we could switch gears here, I think, and pull up the slides for Peak Coalition. We're going to start off with next slide. Daniel, just a little bit of background about who the Peak Coalition is. Peak Coalition really came together about 5 years ago to end the long-standing pollution burden from peaker power plants on New York City's most climate vulnerable people. Together with communities, Peak Coalition is advocating for a system of localized renewable energy and battery storage, as well as other clean alternatives to replace peaker plants to reduce both climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and local emissions, along with lowering energy bills and establishing a more reliable and resilient electric power system. Our work has expanded beyond these initial goals into other areas as well. Next slide. Over the years, Peak Coalition has produced a number of publications. Here are a few of them. Our first was called Dirty Energy, Big Money, which really looked at the cost of peaker power plants both the financial cost to ratepayers and to the tune of millions of dollars each year just to sit online, as well as the health impacts from their localized emissions, a lot through pollution of NOx, nitrogen oxides. The next report we did the following year was called the Fossil Fuel Endgame, which set forward a frontline vision for retiring New York City peaker power plants by 2030 with a mix of renewable energy, battery storage, and efficiency. And just this year, earlier this year, we had a companion report called Accelerate Now, the Fossil Fuel Endgame 2.0, that checked in on progress for peaker transitions since 2019. There has been some retirements and there have been a lot announced, but there's still a lot of work to do, and there have been some issues lately that are slowing down that transition. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to talk and give you a little bit more background about the report we're going to be talking about today.
Thanks, Seth. So for this report, Demanding a Better Grid, we, for the first time, are shifting our focus away from simply looking at the supply side issues that is enabling the extension of peaker plants or the operation of peaker plants in New York City, and really started to think of what is a more comprehensive grid-wide solution to look at the issue of peaker retirement. And it pivots us towards looking at some of the issues that has arisen in the space, such as the rise of data centers, chip manufacturing facilities, but also the increasing electrification of resources that can be both a challenge, but also an opportunity towards phase out of peaker power plants in New York City. And so I think before we start getting into why we're looking at demand management and sort of are the high level benefits and ways we think we should be managing or implementing demand management in New York City, I want to give a little bit of a background on how we got here in the first place, which is really the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And I think there's no better person to sort of give a background on why the Climate Act is so important for New York and for the work that we do in phasing out peaker power plants than Darietta. So I'll let Dottie take it away for now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dariela from the Point CDC. I'm not going to bore you with details about the climate law, but what we do want to emphasize here and talk about is that organizations like Uprose and the Point from the beginning have been creating and participating in coalitions and looking at what are some policies that can be passed, not just like in our neighborhoods and not just to impact our direct communities, but what does implementation of the climate law look like for New York State, and that those same organizations who were advocating and organizing to pass that law are also the same organizations that are trying to implement that law and make sure that it's done right. So organizations like The Point and Uprose, we're both here today. We identify as frontline organizations, frontline communities. And not only are we like trying to implement and trying to make sure that the climate law becomes a reality and not just a law, but that it's safeguarded and that we use cap and trade guardrails, and we do emissions accounting. And so implementation should also be grounded in our shared values. And we're looking at community-led renewables like community-owned solar and other things like electric charging stations. So looking at what does it mean for community, the same frontline communities, to be the ones to pass the law, to have this vision of what the CLCPA can do. And so since we're still the ones implementing that vision, we see it being able to be carried through. So this is just one of the spaces in which we're talking about implementation of the CLCPA, and it's led by the same people who got it passed. And I think I'm passing it back to Seth.
Passing it back to me, but thank you, Dottie. So to give that background, thank you, Dottie, for that really helpful background. We are seeing since 2019 a lot of work on implementing the Climate Act, but also a lot of challenges, right? Since the passage of the Climate Act in 2019, New York really hasn't caught up to where we want to be or where we need to be in order to phase out a lot of the peaker power plants in New York City. It's true that 700 megawatts of peaker power plants have already retired or being phased out, and an additional 3 gigawatts or so has plans to be phased out. However, there are still a lot of challenges underlying the ability to phase out peaker power plants by 2030 and by 2040 as the climate law mandates for a zero emissions grid. We've seen cost challenges, we've seen challenges from inflation, we've seen challenges to a lot of private developers. Profit margin, we've also seen supply chain issues even this year that canceled a lot of offshore projects in New York City and New York City. There's also issues around the under-delivery or promise under-delivery of transmission projects that are being developed in New York State. That is to say that New York State still has a lot to do on the supply side, and we still need, as our last report outlined, the need to accelerate the development of renewable energy and energy storage across New York State. There's also been different kinds of permits and fire code issues that have affected the ability to phase out peaker plants, specifically just in New York City. But all that aside, and not to undermine the need to accelerate a lot of these development needs, there also needs to be a sort of more comprehensive look at, beyond the supply side, what are consumer or large electric consumers' responsibility in helping phase out peaker power plants. And that's when we arrive at the idea or the issue of demand side management. And so to us, there are really 4 core benefits to a properly implemented, a well-rounded demand side management program. The first is reduced emissions and pollutants, right? Even right now, with no additional electrifications, just reducing how much electricity we consume can reduce the operation of peaker power plants, especially during the hottest days in the summer, or even now in the fall when we're seeing 80-degree weather in November. We can see increased grid reliance and reliability because we'll be less prone to blackouts and brownouts, and the possibility that our grid will bounce back faster or have a less likeliness to go out in the event of an extreme weather event or an event where power plants are not operable. We could also see increased community benefits and investments through the development of new workforces, the implementation of new technologies, and most importantly, also as energy rates are have increased over time significantly. Demand management can present an opportunity for increased energy affordability, not just for consumers, but also for businesses and industries. The report that we issued, the Demanding a Better Grid report, really looks and focuses on sort of 2 spectrums of demand side management. These 2 tools are demand response and virtual power plants. Demand response are tools that help stabilize the grid and frequency and offer incentives to participants often to lower energy usage. So think about the texts or emails or messages you get from Con Edison or National Grid to reduce your energy use during the hottest of summer hours or during very hot summer days, and in the future in the coldest winter days. Turn off some lights, reduce the use of air conditioning or heaters, electric heaters. Those are sort of demand response programs. And a lot of those are actually on large businesses that consume a lot of electricity in the first place. I think the threshold to participate in the large scale demand response program in Con Edison is around 50 kilowatts currently as a minimum. And that's sort of the demand response side of demand management. And the other sort of less talked about, but increasingly sort of popular form is virtual power plants, which is a network of distributed energy resources. Think about the scaled up microgrid that is smarter and more responsive to the demands of our systems. So the integration of batteries and solar panels and EV chargers, or even some wind turbines, and all of those different technologies into one centralized and controlled system that sort of acts almost like a power plant that can provide different kinds of services in different sort of hours of demand. And that presents a really exciting and important technology, I think, for us to look at how much these 2 types of tools can help reduce the reliance on peaker power plants in New York City. When we're looking at sort of the major methods that demand response and virtual power plants can reshape our grid, it really comes in 4 forms, right? This is a chart that's adapted from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And what demand management does, it shifts, shapes, shimmies, or sheds demand. So shedding is what we typically think of as reducing the amount of energy, total energy that's being consumed, whereas shifting is shifting when we consume energy. Shape is thinking about using solar and storage to stabilize the peaks of consumption that we have. And shimming is similar to shaping, but also in, say, the 3 a.m. in the evening when offshore wind is being turned on and there's a lot of energy being generated, but not a lot of consumption. We can sort of stabilize those gaps and make sure that energy demand is more stable and more reliable. And with that, I will pass it off to Seth to talk more about sort of what scale are we thinking and talking about in terms of the potential or possibility for demand management in New York City.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So rethinking demand. As Daniel mentioned, currently there is a demand response program in New York City that Con Ed runs, but it's highly underutilized, particularly on the residential side. Con Ed has 3.6 million customers, and of those 3.6 million, as far as residential participation in the program, it's only about 37,000. Just for a frame of 37,000 customers that participate. As a frame of reference, Commonwealth Edison, which provides power to 3.8 million customers in the Chicago area, has 400,000 residential customers participating in their demand response program, where they're able to reduce demand by 120 megawatts. That's many times what Con Ed is able to do with their residential participation. So if we go to the next slide, we worked with a technical partner to assess what the possibility for demand reduction looked like in New York City, also New York State, but we'll focus on the city for this side. So they looked at a report that was done for Maine by Brattle Group that assessed the possibility for Maine to be able to leverage and have flexibility in demand for electric vehicles and electric heating. So we applied that same methodology to New York City to see what the opportunity could be. And this is looking at the electrification that is planned, or the load growth that is planned for New York City. The New York State independent system operator estimated that by 2050, power demand in the city will increase by about 20 to 45% in the summer, and up to 170% in the winter due to electrification, as well as some large loads for things like data centers and microchip manufacturing. But this represents a load growth of over 2 megawatts in the summer and almost 12 megawatts in the winter. We'll look at the ISO tends to look at this load as just load, something that needs to be supplied. But we're looking at, okay, what if this is something that can help, as Daniel mentioned, to shape, reshape, shimmy, and shift when energy demand actually happens. Based on that methodology that was done in Maine, the opportunity that was found, depending on how much could actually be shifted, was the potential for that summer shift in New York City was anywhere from 500 megawatts to over 1,100 megawatts in the summer, which comes close to meeting about half of that estimated increase in the summer demand. In the winter, the opportunity for demand shifting and demand management in the winter is about 660 megawatts to almost 1,500 megawatts. Now, the winter demand is supposed to spike quite a bit more than summer, but that still represents a significant fraction of the load growth that is expected in New York City, and represents the size of, greater than the size of any of the largest peaker power plants in New York City. It represents a significant portion of the peaker capacity that is in New York City. So real opportunity here with load flexibility. On the next slide, we also looked at the potential savings from virtual power plants. So this is actually from a Department of Energy report that was Pathways to Commercial Liftoff for Virtual Power Plants. And that describes the costs and benefits of virtual power plants. These are, again, aggregations of lots of different types of loads. That could be thermostats, smart thermostats, EV charging, battery storage, lots of different flexible loads, water heating as well. It looked at the costs of implementing something like a virtual power plant to meet peak load versus more traditional sources of peaker generation. That's natural gas peaker plants, which is what's used mostly today, or utility scale battery storage, which is increasingly being deployed for peak demand. California has over 10 gigawatts of storage now, and Texas is rapidly catching that number. So according to their findings, you can see here in the graphs, the red dotted line, virtual power plants were the most cost-effective source of peaking power. That's the net cost. So on the black and the gray side of the graph, that is the capital expense is the black, so what it costs to actually build it, and then the operating expense is the gray, what it takes to operate this. So you see virtual power plants, they have significant operating costs because you're dealing with often thousands of different resources, but these are already built. So the CapEx is actually non-existent for those. And when you weigh the benefits, these are the on the green side versus the cost, the net cost of virtual power plants was significantly less. In fact, it's 40% less expensive to deploy a virtual power plant of the same size versus a utility scale battery storage installation, and it's 60% less expensive than a natural gas peaker plant to do a virtual power plant. So on the next slide, this is the last of my slides here, just what does that mean in terms of savings for New York State and New York City? So if they were to deploy virtual power plants instead of large-scale battery storage capacity for peak generation, which is being done in New York City, this is the net present value of that investment, the savings in millions by 2050. So you can see for New York State, the savings over just building out large-scale batteries could be $1.5 billion to $4.5 billion, depending on how much flexibility you could be able to utilize. And for New York City, that translates into about up to $1 billion. Now, the savings versus natural gas, a new natural gas plant, is about double that. For New York City, it's over $2 billion in savings versus building a new gas plant. So that's just a really quick look at the numbers. There's a lot more in the report. So now I'm going to pass it off to Sebastian to talk about demand management for energy justice.
Thanks, Seth. We've talked a little bit about demand management and what its benefits are, and what it would potentially take to implement a demand management system in New York City. But I think it's also important to recognize that the way this is done, the way we implement demand management, also must be done in a just way. And I think that's useful to actually recenter the lives and the lived experiences of the people who bear the consequences of peaker plants. So as a reminder from our first Dirty Energy Big Money report, 78% of the 750,000 people who live within a half mile of a peaker plant in New York City are low income or non-white, and these people are breathing in air pollutants. Sometimes these air pollutants contribute as much as 94% of nitrogen oxide emissions on high ozone days. So when the sky gets foggy, it's often because of these peaker plants. And of course, the people who live closest to it are on the front lines of that exposure, contributing to respiratory illnesses, asthma attacks, other issues. Additionally, the Peak Coalition mapped out which neighborhoods are called on to reduce demand and which neighborhoods actually experience brownouts and blackouts. And we found that these tend to be working class communities of color. This graph on the right shows that, a lot of neighborhoods received requests for reducing their electricity demand. So this is the text from Con Ed or a notice from the city that says, we're experiencing a heat wave. We need you to reduce your energy demand. But because of a lot of factors, working class communities of color, those in the darker areas shown at right, they're actually called on to reduce demand more. Additionally, existing research about 311 calls to or from communities, when there is a blackout, finds that they tend to be concentrated in Black and brown neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that are people of color and, again, low income. So we know that the existing system of peaker plants is an environmental justice and an energy justice issue. And what's more, these neighborhoods also have high energy burdens. So they're paying a lot of money out of their pocket for electricity, and they have high heat vulnerability. Yet still, the peaker plants that we have today can't provide reliable power, and they still, contribute to significant energy burdens for, tons of New Yorkers. So that can't continue. Next slide. So how can we structure demand management for energy justice? Well, to reduce the air pollution from peaker power plants, demand management programs should be structured in a variety of ways. They should provide short-term operational need for peakers. So instead of having to turn on a peaker on a hot summer day tomorrow, for instance, or hot November day, um, a demand management program that is structured in a just way could actually activate and say, you know, we can provide X amount of electricity instead of the electricity that would come from a peaker plant. So this is reducing the operational need for peakers in the short term. In the long term, where peakers are identified as reliability assets to meet any potential deficits in our electrical grid, energy supply, this demand management program, it can be scaled up in a targeted way so that it is actually able to provide the amount of necessary energy on those, peak electricity days in the future, eliminating the need to not only build new peakers but also retain existing ones. In this way, every single day, every single year, that peaker plants are no longer online, even while they're being kept on standby and tested. Uh, that is another day, another year that they don't emit air pollutants in environmental justice neighborhoods. Additionally, addressing the energy burden faced by low-income ratepayers across the city, a demand management program structured for energy justice can reduce the amount of money that people pay for peaker plants, which between 2010 and 2019 amounted to $4.5 billion. This cost would be eliminated from people's electricity bills. Instead, a demand management program, by calling on people and households to activate, whether it be battery storage or deferring or reducing their electricity demand, they can get compensation for actually participating in a demand management program and therefore reduce their electricity bills further. But of course, we know that we need to recruit and incentivize the recruitment of low and moderate income households so that they are able to participate in ways that higher income households can. Additionally, this recruitment should also include simple, language accessible enrollment and compensation. So making sure that just like utilities, utility information is provided in a variety of languages, it's simple to understand and available to any New Yorker. Moreover, a lot of these demand management programs or energy programs in general don't tend to have strong consumer protections, but we want to make sure that a demand management program that is just has strong consumer protections that actually enable residents and consumers to not distrust their utility further. And lastly, having a demand management program for energy justice actually creates workforce development pathways where electricians, technicians can be trained and have apprenticeships to actually maintain the wide variety of software and hardware that will be required to actually be able to have a grid that can reduce demand from people's homes. So making sure that those pathways are there is another way that some of these communities who have borne the brunt of air pollution can actually participate in solutions. Next slide. However, there are some barriers to demand management for energy justice. The two main ones are the slow adoption of electric appliances by low-income and non-white households. Research has shown for a variety of appliances and distributed energy resources in general, low-income and people of color uh, generally don't adopt those devices, those appliances, those resources at the same rates as higher income and white households. And so a solution to this would be to pair demand management programs with the actual electric appliances and distributed energy resources that our state, our city are rolling out. So something that comes to mind is community solar and battery storage, having that be developed in collaboration with uh, actually being enrolled in a demand management program so that you're not just having the clean energy resources, but you're also having the equitable benefits of being able to participate in that demand management program. And of course, a lot of customers distrust utilities, and so a pathway for reducing the participation to, or for improving the participation to demand management would actually be to engage and educate communities through trusted community organizations that can communicate with uh, people of color, low-income residents through existing ways in their language, in formats that are understandable to them. So distrust of utilities, slow adoption of electric appliances, those are barriers, but they are surmountable. With that, I'll hand it to Megan to discuss some regulatory landscape concerns.
Thank you, Sebastian. I will speak to everyone about the regulatory landscape and how the present law and potential legal reform could address this issue. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to better grasp why these DR and VPP programs we're advocating for are not widely in place, it's helpful to understand who is in charge of utilities. So there are three main models of utilities in the US. There are cooperatives, which are not-for-profit member-owned. There are publicly owned utilities owned by your federal, state, or municipalities. And then there are investor-owned utilities, which are owned by shareholders. And even though investor-owned utilities are small in number because they tend to be really enormous companies, they make up the majority of the landscape. So 72% of US consumers receive their electricity from an IOU. 66% of US consumers receive their electricity from an IOU that has been granted a monopoly over electricity distribution, meaning they have no competition. This is, of course, the case in New York City, where we have Con Edison. Monopolies are incredibly common in this industry. It's often called a natural monopoly because of the sort of infrastructure required when you think about building out transmission lines and distribution lines, so on and so forth. The idea of having multiple providers compete is often seen as duplicative. And because we have this monopolistic corporations providing us with essential services such as electric and gas, we also have a state agency that is charged with regulating them. In New York, this is called the Public Service Commission, and other states have their own version of this agency. So the astounding impact of utility behavior is reflected in the fact that they are so closely subject to this regulation at all. Most of the time in the US, the state doesn't tell companies what they can charge for goods. The reason that these private entities can be so directly regulated by the government is because the Supreme Court found way back in 1876 that when private property is so affected by the public interest, it ceases to be a solely private right. And this set the stage for the regulatory compact that still governs today. So the big takeaway from this slide and this issue is that a majority of consumers have no choice in the utility they choose, and they have no direct voice in how it operates. Utilities in New York are regulated by the PSC, whose leadership is appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate. So when a consumer using a monopolistic investor-owned utility has an issue with their provider, whether it be affordability, reliability, resilience, investments or lack of thereof in a greener grid and renewables and so on, they have little to no recourse for anything else to do. And as a baseline, this is really concerning given the impact of utility planning and operation on many areas, including greenhouse gas emissions, grid resiliency, and of course, cost to consumers. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start by reading this short quote. I think it's very clear that the reason we're not building the grid of the future that we've seen pictures of a million times is because we have a policy and regulatory structure that has the incentives to rebuild the old system as opposed to build the new system. This quote shows that the point emphasized in our report about bad incentives is certainly not a new one. It's not our discovery, and we're not the only ones making this point. This comes from the chairman of NYSERDA. So what are the bad incentives and why are they continuing? So for more detail, I really do encourage you to read the report, but put briefly, the situation is that, as I talked about in the first slide, we have a lot of investor-owned utilities in this country and in New York specifically. Importantly, their goal is to make money for their shareholders, full stop, which is why I included this Simple but profound picture here about bad ideas and ideas that make money. This exemplifies what a number of people who write about utilities call the perverse incentives. Investor-owned utilities are going to pursue ideas that make money. That is what they're set up to do, and we can't expect them to behave differently. So when it comes to utilities, what are these really bad ideas? The bad idea is increasing capital expenditure as much as possible. This came up on the earlier slide that Seth discussed, which talked about CAPEX and OPEX. So given the formula used by regulators when setting rates in a rate case, utilities can reap a profit off of capital expenses. For example, a new substation, but not from operating expenses, such as the implementation of a demand response program. This is inefficient generally. It incentivizes capital expenditure over operating expenditure, which is often harmful for the environment, as capital expenditure can include fossil fuel infrastructure and otherwise often just enables a traditional grid that is fossil fuel reliant. And even when there is a real need for new capital investment, such as upgrading transmission or battery storage, because the return for the utility is based on their cost as opposed to the value that they are delivering, there's no incentive for them to lower their costs, even for these essential capital investments, which they could do by negotiating down the cost of raw material, for example. But they have an incentive to do the opposite. And importantly, this is harmful for the ratepayer, who sees an increase in their utility bills in order to fund infrastructure that the utility may not even need, or perhaps fund essential infrastructure at a cost that could be much, much lower. If you live in New York City, as I do, you've seen a lot of these rate increases over the past many years. And if you want to look more into the nitty-gritty, there are some legal scholars who write a lot about the formula that the regulators use, and I'll just highlight Heather Payne at Seton Hall Law School, who's written extensively on this, and I've learned a lot from her scholarship. So now I will pass it back to my colleague, Daniel.
So thank you, Megan, for laying out some of the sort of big challenges on the regulatory side on how, there is a lot of disincentives in implementing demand management systems. But the question now is, how do we change that? And, for now, we still live in a democracy, and there are ways that the public can have input into the way our rates are set and our energy grid is being regulated and is being built. Number one, I think the most important thing that is coming up for New York City is that the 3-year rate case for condensate should be coming out fairly soon. And in those rate cases, consumers can really push to prioritize demand response programs and other non-wire solutions with hard infrastructure that replaces hard infrastructure or is in addition to hard infrastructure to lower emissions and produce bill savings, right? Con Edison, like any other utility that's investor-owned, is incentivized to build hard infrastructure in order to reap as much profit as possible based on the regulated system. But a lot of these soft costs and soft infrastructure does not guarantee a return on investment and does not sort of guarantee that they can reap benefits from the bills that consumers pay in terms of delivery costs. And I think being able to participate and make your voices heard on the need for increased demand response programs or demand side management tools in rate cases is very important. There are, however, not just rate cases, but many other proceedings across New York State on how the energy grid is being built and being regulated. There's a variety of rate cases on the clean energy standards, which is how we build large-scale renewables, or even smaller distributed renewables as well. There is rate cases on the value of distributed energy resources, which is how New York State values the cost for building virtual power plants and various other resources that go into becoming a virtual power plant. There is a relatively new proceeding called the Grid of the Future that looks actually at some of the things that we mentioned in this report, also around virtual power plants and demand response issues. And on a public service commission level and a Department of Public Service level, there is a lot of different sort of places where people can submit comments, go to public hearings or testimonies, and go to technical conferences and ask questions about how our grid is being built and how it is being regulated, and present an opportunity for us to give input to let regulators and utility companies know that this is a priority for consumers because of the many benefits that it brings. Quickly pass it back to Megan on sort of the legislative side of things.
Thank you. So demand response and virtual power plants are tools to maximize efficiency and maintain a stable grid while minimizing the need to turn on harmful, expensive, polluting peaker plants, which have a disproportionate impact on Black, Brown, and low-income New Yorkers. So how could legislative reform or restructuring jumpstart the implementation of robust demand response and virtual power plant programs? First, I want to emphasize that most virtual power plant programs in other states have grown out of regulatory mandates and agreements with utilities. So the PSC in New York also does possess broad powers to regulate, and while their discretion is not boundless, they do already have the capability to regulate differently, to negotiate different requirements when setting rates. And the PSC has already at times strayed from their norm when it comes to regulating utilities and achieved promising results when doing so, which you can read more about. The PSC is also conducting multiple proceedings, as Daniel just discussed, to inform their action in this arena of DR and VPPs. But in some, even without any statutory change, the PSC could evolve in how it regulates utilities and could do a lot more to ensure that these programs are in place. Second, New York could follow the lead of a few other states, including Maryland and Colorado, which now have laws on the books requiring in different forms that utilities implement virtual power plants. These laws impose some requirements upon the utility regulator. For example, the Maryland law requires that the regulator expedite processes for interconnecting bidirectional electric vehicle systems to the grid, which can play a key part in virtual power plants. But for both of these laws, much of the work actually and the cost falls on the utilities themselves, not the public regulator. Our report also highlights that Solar United Neighbors has released a model law along with a model tariff, which is the pricing structure for VPP implementation. And no similar law is yet proposed in New York State Legislature, but we are hopeful that that can change. And that's it from me.
Thanks, Megan. So with all of that knowledge in place, what's next for us? Like what is the sort of priority for demand management systems, and what do we want to see out of it? We know that there are extensions to peaker plant permits from the Gowanus peaker plant and the Narrows peaker plant that's currently in place, that we don't want them to be further extended beyond 2027. We know that the Public Service Commission has threatened to extend New York State's 70% renewable by 2030 mandate to 2033 or even further on. And we also know that the New York Independent System Operator has some concerns about reliability, but also in their most recent report, they pointed out how lower than expected demand can reduce the need for fossil assets to stay on longer than they need to be. And so in a demand management system that we want to see being built out, and we understand that these can be done in a fairly accelerated manner, in that it can be a sort of short to medium term solution to a lot of the peaker plant retirement issues that we've been seeing. We really want to see four goals coming out of a different regime for energy management, right? The four sort of top line priority that we want to see in any kind of demand management system is that it's able to reduce greenhouse gas and co-pollutant emissions, reduce the reliance on peaker plants, and reduce the permits that is being issued towards them, increase reliability through the use of virtual power plants, or just reducing the amount of blackouts or brownouts that is happening in our neighborhoods, especially in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, encourage the deployment of new technologies and investments in disadvantaged communities that New York City Environmental Justice Alliance serves, and where Uprose and The Point is serving in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, and increase energy affordability and price stability, as Seth pointed out in his slides about how much savings technologies like virtual power plants can provide everyday New Yorkers. But also at the same time, low-income residents and people of color who suffer disproportionate from ill effects of air pollution and the highest heat vulnerability indexes must be prioritized in any sort of programs going forward. So if you think about places like East New York, places like North Staten Island, those are the places where demand management programs must be prioritized to be deployed in. there are also things that all of us can do. As I mentioned earlier, Con Edison has an upcoming rate case that people should participate in and make your voices heard in those areas and spaces. There is also a bill in the New York State that's passed almost every year, I think in 3 or 4 years in a row, called the Utility Intervenor Reimbursement Bill. The governor has either vetoed or not signed this bill for years at this point, but this bill provides consumers the ability to get paid for participating in rate cases where utilities are getting paid to be a part of these rate cases. It's built into the bill and it's being charged on us. So why shouldn't we get some reimbursements for being able to participate in rate cases? In looking towards the medium to long term, there's a bunch of other things that could be done in terms of legislative mandate for demand side management, creating an opt-out demand response system so that all of the new electrifying resources are automatically enrolled instead of having to be voluntarily enrolled into a demand response program, reforms around monopoly utilities, building new thermal energy networks to reduce reliance on peaker power plants and reduce sort of grid constraints, and overall decentralization of our grid. These are sort of more medium long term, but I think all of these things are things that we should be discussing today, and it hasn't been seen enough in sort of the space of New York's energy regime that we think should be done in terms of pushing forward a new demand management and the way we look at demand in terms of our energy grid. And I think that concludes this presentation. And I think we have some time left for questions and answers.
Yes, great. Thank you all. We've had quite a few questions coming in, so we'll get through the ones that we can get through if folks want to turn their cameras back on. A question that came in was about Con Ed using messages to customers to cut back on their demand. Basically, the question is there a peak notification program to notify customers and ask for a voluntary cutback when the most expensive form of generation is needed? And if so, how does it work? Because the cost of notifying customers is pretty much zero.
Yeah, I think there is a system in which folks are already getting texts. If you live in some of the neighborhoods that's getting most of these texts, as Sebastian shown in the map, you probably are aware that Con Edison will email you or notify you if they want you to reduce demand. But because of how it also disincentivizes them from making money from delivering energy to your house. So it really only is used as a last minute solution instead of as an overall strategy in terms of how much energy we are consuming on an everyday basis. And so with the need for us individually to take action, it makes it a lot harder for consumers to save money from sort of the shift in demand. And we also doesn't have such a rigorous sort of time of use rates in New York City compared to some of the other municipalities because of how cheap our energy already is in most times of the year, except certain cases where customers are getting $3,000 monthly bills for electricity. And so there really is a need to make sure that the system is scaled in a way that everyone can benefit from it, and that we don't have to constantly sort of manually tinker around our light bulbs or our washing machines in order to save money and save pollution and emissions.
Yeah, and then to the question of does it work? Yeah, it can. This can result in megawatts of reduction. California has demonstrated that they can avoid blackouts by calling on customers to reduce demand. One of the issues there, and Daniel was talking about this some, is there's a notification to customers to take an action that would be increased if there was just compensation for folks to provide this valuable service to the utility. Also, there are ways that this can be automated through smart devices that's not being fully utilized today either. Question came in just related to the virtual power plants. When I mentioned that there's no capital cost because they're already built, they said they don't understand what that means, that they're already built. Essentially, a virtual power plant utilizes all the distributed resources, EV chargers, batteries, smart thermostats that are already being deployed in people's homes. So the utility is not paying that upfront investment to build these resources out. The investment on their side is the infrastructure to manage the virtual power plant, which could be done through a third-party aggregator, somebody else that manages it on behalf of the utility. question came in that I think you addressed here at the end, Daniel, was, is there a possibility to add demand response to weatherization and as a precondition for drawing down on state energy efficiency rebates? So I don't know if you want to address that, Daniel. I think that gets to like your opt-out notice. Like,
Yeah, I think we already touched on a little bit in terms of having an opt-out system, and that's exactly what it is, right? Seth showed like there is dozens to hundreds of megawatts, or thousands in some cases statewide of savings coming from new electrifying resources, or the potential to do that. That potential is currently relying on people voluntarily enrolling in these demand response or demand management programs. So if we sort of eliminate the need for customers, every single one of us in every single household or industries or businesses, to take that step, it makes it a lot easier in times of higher demand. We have devices or programs that can automatically shut off some of the needs and services. If you look at some lights that shut off in office buildings automatically after a certain amount of time or in certain times of day, that is exactly what it is. That is something that should be done to every single electrifying device. And my air conditioning is connected to Wi-Fi. Why can't it automatically be enrolled in the demand response program when it's already connected to sort of the World Wide Web and people have access to it in certain ways? And that's sort of what we're envisioning, is that in the future, having an opt-out demand response program can alleviate a lot of the need for consumers, but especially households that are already working, many hours a day, doesn't have a lot of time or money or attention being paid to the system, the electric system. Eliminate a lot of the burden that they have to do to reduce pollution in their own neighborhoods and reduce the amount of money they're paying into their utilities.
Great. And this next question is something I'll throw open to everybody because we talk about it a lot, is what can we do to combat the rhetoric that there is not enough established technology to support the grid in alternate ways, and thus making the case for continued reliance on fossil fuel peaker plants? I mean, I'm happy to start on that one. This is something we deal with a lot. The fact is that these reliability concerns, a lot are, sometimes they're not completely unjustified, because the state and the city have not prioritized the development of clean alternatives and have not reduced some of the barriers to development of clean alternatives in New York City, to make sure that these peakers can be retired on the schedule that has been set. We've already seen that, where peaker plants are being kept online in environmental justice neighborhoods to meet those reliability needs. Sometimes these reliability needs are also overblown. They look at worst case scenarios, and the modeling does not accurately predict the way that new loads will actually come online. But there is a real need to reduce the barriers to support more solar, support offshore wind, support more battery development, to be able to tackle these peaker power plants and replace them in a reliable manner. So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, if you look at how much energy demand New York City has, it really hasn't changed that much or increased that much. In fact, it has decreased at points over the last 20 years. I remember this is one of the major reasons why the New York Power Authority built 6 peaker plants in New York City back in around 2001. And they are now on track to phase out all of them by 2030. And we had a 20-year sort of constant and relatively stable energy demand. And we've had, in the same time, a 3,000% growth in the solar industry. You can walk around New York City streets, you'll see solar panels on rooftops, you'll see electric vehicles being used, and taxis being used by regular customers, people on the streets. These are technologies that are mature, these are technologies that are ready, and these are technologies that are in many cases cheaper than paying $450 million a year to keep peaker power plants online. And so this really is not just sort of a technology maturity question. The technology is already there, in our view, right? A lot of these technologies is already being deployed in New York, in a lot of other places, on an everyday basis. And it's really about sort of, are we prioritizing them over the use of traditional polluting resources?
Can I jump in on this one real quick?
Sure.
I guess two big points. One regarding the reliability issue, which is a real one. the framing from the utilities should be approached with a lot of skepticism. And when we think about a rate case, I like the head nods I'm seeing. When we think about a rate case, the utility approaches the PSC saying we need X amount of investment, which is passed on to the ratepayer in order to just keep things going, keep everything online. And then an 11-month-long negotiation ensues in which they don't get exactly what they ask for. They always ask for more than they need. They always, like Seth's saying, there's a lot of overplaying the reliability risk. Not that there isn't some legitimacy to it, but they also have an incentive to play it up. And if it really was just the utilities asking for exactly what they need and nothing else, there would be no reason for negotiation. And the second point is that when we think about risk aversion, because the PSC understandably would be risk averse when it comes to something like a blackout or brownout that is completely unmanaged, it would be a disaster. But it's also important to think about, like, the status quo is not risk averse. It's just about who's being put at risk and what's being put at risk. So even on a day-to-day basis, there are a lot of communities whose health and well-being and the environment we all share is put at risk. So it's really different things that are being, put at risk here, but it's not that the status quo is safe and sound and can perpetually continue.
Great. Well said. Thank you. But I think we got time for one more question here.
Ariella, did you want to jump in on that last question?
Oh.
I was just nodding my head because and this wasn't named specifically, but it's one of the fears that most people have when we talk about peakers, and understanding that it's a scare tactic. Like, we've seen this happen in so many other areas of our work. If you're really afraid of, like, not having that sustainability, not having that reliability, you will, like, think a little differently about what this infrastructure does and how useful it is. There's so many things that can be done to prevent a brownout or blackout, before actually saying, like, if we don't have this, we're gonna lose power. Like, there's so many other interventions that can be used, and it's causing confusion, and it's causing a fear, but very intentionally and strategically, and it's something that we know and recognize already.
Thank you, Ariel. I think we got one last question. And Megan, I'm curious if this is something you'd like to address. Somebody raised, will we be talking about performance-based regulation to remove the capital expense bias of cost of service regulation, noting that several states are moving this way and Hawaii has adopted this framework. Megan, I don't know if that's something that you've looked into as you've looked at the utility incentives.
Yeah, I think that performance-based regulation instead of cost of service is something that is very consistent with what we outline in our report. Besides just the incentive they have for capital expenditure, like I was saying before, the return on cost as opposed to value just leads to so much inefficiency and so much cost passed on to the ratepayer. And with performance-based regulation, I think what's really necessary is a sort of comprehensive take that not only gets rid of the bad incentives that exist, but that gives the utilities new incentives, because at the end of the day, they're trying to make money. When they are investing on things, there's some rate of return that is necessary for them to do their jobs, and changing the incentives in a comprehensive way is exactly what we need.
Great. Well, with that, I would like to thank you all. Thank our presenters that spoke today. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, please do go check out the report. There's a lot more information. I think some of the questions we didn't get to will be answered if you read through the report. So thank you, everyone. Zareen, I'll turn it over to you if there are any closing thoughts.
Thanks again, everyone. Just a heads up, a reminder, the webinar recording will be emailed to all attendees, and you can find our upcoming webinars at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.